So I want to talk about two directives that are related to the circular economy and often applicable to machinery. But there are a few kind of scope exclusions which it'd be interesting to get into and just talk about. So the first one is RoHS. So this is the restriction of the use of certain hazardous substances in electrical and electronic equipment. And the other one is the WEEE directive, which is related to waste electrical and electronic equipment and its disposal. So the first one we'll have a look at is RoHS. The reason that I'm lumping these two together is that the scope and the exclusions for both of them are the same. They function in slightly different ways, and we'll get into that, and we'll also have a look at a piece of guidance documentation that will help us navigate what are the exclusions to these particular directives as well. Something else to note, the RoHS directive is a CE marking directive, whereas the WEEE directive is not. So the symbol for the WEEE directive is that wheelie bin with a cross in it and a bar underneath. But we will start with the RoHS directive. So we'll just scroll down, we'll just find the scope, because that's the first thing we want to look at. We want to work out whether our piece of machinery falls within the scope of the RoHS directive. So this directive shall, subject to paragraph 2, apply to EEE, so electrical and electronic equipment, that is, falling within the categories set out in Annex 1. So let's flick down and take a look at Annex 1. So Annex 1, categories of EEE covered by this directive: large household appliances, small household appliances, IT and telecommunications equipment, consumer equipment, lighting equipment, electronic and electronic tools, toys, leisure and sports equipment, medical devices, monitoring and control instruments, including instrumental monitoring and control instruments, automatic dispensers, other EEE, not covered by any of the categories above. So this is really vague and really general. So it's quite unhelpful, particularly item 11, other EEE, not covered by any of the categories above. So if we skip back up to the scope, so we've established that this isn't actually very helpful. So almost any electrical equipment falls into this. So let's have a look at the exclusions. So what this directive does not apply to. This might be a bit more helpful. So equipment which is necessary for the protection of essential interests of security. Okay, so arms, munitions, war material. Okay, that makes sense. But what's more applicable to kind of machinery? You know, we're talking about CE marking, typically talking about end users or manufacturers of machinery. So where are we? So the two here that are, well, there's more than two. There's a couple that are kind of interesting, potentially applicable. So large-scale industrial tools are excluded. Large-scale fixed installations are excluded. Means of transport for persons or goods, however, excluding electrical or electric two-wheeled vehicles, which are not type approved. So that's things like electric scooters or e-bikes. So they are included in the scope. The other one is non-road mobile machinery made available exclusively for professional use. So there's kind of three items here which might be applicable if you are a machine builder. Now if we scroll down a little bit further, we've got definitions within this article, within this directive, and this will help us navigate a little bit better some of those kind of ambiguous items that were above. Large-scale stationary industrial tools means a large-scale assembly of machines, so more than one machine, equipment or components functioning together for a specific application. So that's not general, so this knows exactly where it's going, what it's going to be used for, permanently installed and deinstalled by professionals at a given place and used and maintained by professionals in an industrial manufacturing facility or research and development facility. Okay, so that makes some sense. A large-scale fixed installation means a large-scale combination, again, several pieces of machinery, so several types of apparatus, and where applicable other devices, which are assembled and installed by professionals intended to be used permanently in a predefined and dedicated location and deinstalled by professionals. But we could say potentially that this is still a bit vague. What does it mean by installed in a predefined and dedicated location. And what do we mean by permanently, potentially? Functioning together for a specific application. So thankfully, we have a guidance document. Again, publicly available, helpful bit of documentation for expanding on some of the scopes. Now there's other questions and queries in here which might be helpful just to be aware of, but we are going to stick with thinking about large scale exclusions and what does that mean as we're thinking about the scope of our directives. So what are large scale industrial tools and large scale fixed installations? What have we got in here? So we have two exclusions, large scale industrial tools and large scale fixed installations. Both terms are explained in definitions of Article 3.3 and 3.4. However, it's not explained what large scale means. Okay, that's helpful. Both categories are combinations of various types of items, such as machinery, components, etc. We've seen that, for permanent use for a specific place. Therefore, the two categories may overlap. However, it is important to consider the meaning of large scale, because that could be a bit subjective. In absolute terms, may be a different one for tools and installations, as there are two differences between tools and installations. Tools are essentially machines, standalone or assemblies, often with moving parts, and used, for example, for the treatment or manufacture of materials and working pieces. The machinery directive can be used as a guide. Typical machine tools can also be part of fixed installations. So that's kind of adding to the complexity slightly here. In order to benefit from either exclusion, the tool or installation must meet all respective requirements as stated below. It has to be, so for a tool, an assembly of machines, equipment and or components functioning together for a specific application, permanently installed and deinstalled by professionals at a given place, used and maintained by professionals, and has to be large scale. And again, for the installation, a combination of several types of apparatus, where applicable, other devices, assembled, installed and deinstalled by professionals, with the intention to be used permanently in a predefined and dedicated location, and it has to be large scale. So large scale is a shared requirement across both of those. So they're saying evidently this draws a line between large tools and installations benefiting from an exclusion and otherwise similar smaller equipment. Large scale refers to dimensional or similar criteria as explained below, although this criteria is not specific in RoHS 2. Yes, okay, which is why we need this bit of guidance documentation. So they've kindly given some examples here of large scale fixed installations benefiting from an exclusion. So production and processing lines, including robots, machine tools, industrial food, print media. Okay, simple passenger lifts, conveyor transport systems, automated storage systems, electronic distribution systems such as generators. So this is giving us a good idea of kind of what large scale means, what they had in mind. Railway signalling infrastructure, fixed installed cooling, air conditioning and refrigeration systems or heating systems designed exclusively for non-residential use. And then examples of large-scale stationary industrial tools benefiting from an exclusion. So machines for the industrial production and processing of materials and goods such as CNC lathes, bridge-type milling and drilling machines, metal forming presses, newspaper printing presses, machines for the testing of workpieces such as electron beam, laser, bright light and deep ultraviolet defect detection systems, automated integrated circuit board and printing wiring board testers, cranes, other machinery of similar size, complexity and weight. Another helpful comment here, so as a general rule, benchtop tools and IT equipment do not fall within the category of large-scale stationary industrial tools. So tools and installations that do not fall within the examples above should be assessed individually with respect to the wording of the exclusions. They put this a bit in bold. The burden of proof is with the responsible economic operator. So what does it mean if your equipment isn't within one of these exclusions? So what does it mean to be compliant, or what are the requirements of RoHS? So RoHS is the restriction of hazardous substances. What are these hazardous substances? Well, if we go down to Annex 2, it's got a list of them. So these are the materials that need to be controlled within your equipment. And the next question is, how do you know if you're compliant? How do you communicate compliance? So most of these materials, you're only going to find them in electrical equipment. You're not going to find them in the steel body of your piece of machinery. And therefore, if you can justify or communicate compliance at a subcomponent level, so if you have a PCB that is manufactured, if you can justify and document evidence that that PCB is compliant, then that is your best way of communicating compliance to RoHS. So as machinery builders, typically you've got lots of subcomponents. Those suppliers will understand the RoHS directive, and they will be able to provide you with some sort of statement or a declaration of conformity stating that their components are compliant. Now, if it turns out you've got components in there that aren't compliant, well, what's the easiest thing to do? The easiest thing to do is going to be find another supplier, if you can, that understands RoHS, that can give you a declaration of conformity stating compliance to this directive. Now, what are the other avenues? So the other avenue, if you can't do that and you've come up with something novel, or if you just don't know what the limits are within your components, then some sort of testing is going to be required. Now, universities can often provide that, but obviously that's quite expensive, so where possible we want to avoid that. So that's a brief introduction to RoHS. Now, if we have a look at WEEE, so we have the same scope and we have the same set of exclusions. So we can use that RoHS guidance document to help us understand what is large scale. Their definition of EEE is also the same. So if one applies, the other is going to apply as well. But the question is, if WEEE applies, what do you do with it? What does it actually mean? Okay, so this is putting obligations onto those putting product onto the market. So what you need to do, I'm looking over here because I just want to draw this window over here. So I'm talking about the UK. So this is the guidance for the regulation of waste electrical and electronic equipment. Now, the premise of this directive is to put ownership onto manufacturers of electrical and electronic equipment as to how the product is disposed of, so contributing to the circular economy. So how do they do that? Again, this is just on the Gov website, and this is a snippet from the directive itself. What are they requiring? So they require that producers register as producers annually, and they need to register with a PCS scheme. So there are various nuances in here. So if it's the case that the producer is producing or placing less than 5 tons of EEE on the UK market in a single year, they can register directly with the environmental regulator as a small producer. It's going to cost you less. Otherwise, you're going to need to register with a producer compliance scheme. And there are lists of who those are, and they can be found on this website as well. So for more information on producer compliance schemes and WEEE and compliance in the UK, I would recommend going to the Gov website and seeking that information out and finding a PCS scheme. There are plenty of providers out there. There's a list on the Gov website, engaging with them and ensuring compliance to the requirements. Now, I hope that's been a helpful brief insight into the scope of RoHS and WEEE and what those mean.